Hello everyone, including a small army of new folks. A quick shout out to Hitscan for sending over a huge swath of new folks to check out my content, and a huge thank you to all of you guys who did come over from that channel just to give me a quick look. With that out of the way, today I'm going to be doing an episode of Computing Competitive on the G2 European Brawl 2. For those of you who are new and don't know what Computing Competitive episodes are about, it's a series where I tackle recent high-profile Valorant events and sort of get you guys the stats of the event as quickly as possible after the event occurred. And so let's get right into it. The G2 Esports European Brawl 2 was hosted across both May 26th and 27th. It featured 10 teams, 9 were regionally locked, with a 10th team focused around the player's Scream, which featured sort of the leftovers after they made the regionally centric teams. It included 2 players from Fish123, 2 players from Prodigy, as well as David P, which many people will recognize as a Belgian CSGO player. The event started with a group stage where 2 teams were eliminated, then moved on to a single elimination playoffs bracket with the final 8. And the purpose of this competition is really just to showcase the top talent in Europe. You see players in this competition from more or less every one of the high-profile rosters in the region. Players from Prodigy, players from Fish123, players from IDDQD, players from Valorando. The list goes on and on. Many of the most prolific names in European Valorant thus far were playing in this competition. I would say that in terms of profile of this event, it is of the same magnitude for Europe as the T1 Invitational was for North America. For those of you concerned about spoilers, cover your ears now. The tournament ended in a final between Team Scream and Team Finland. As I mentioned earlier, Team Scream being composed of 2 players from Fish123, 2 players from Prodigy, and David P from CSGO, where Team Finland was made predominantly of the roster of IDDQD, along with Jerax, who's actually a Dota 2 pro, and Jasmine, who's another CSGO regular. In that final, it was actually relatively one-sided. Scream ran away with it in a 2-0. And so with the high-level overview out of the way, let's start jumping into the stats. If we take a look at map play rates, the G2 EU Brawl 2 used much a similar map ban system as most of the other events up until this point. That system resulted in Bind being played 12 times, Haven being played 12 times, and Split being played a disappointing 4 times. This comes as a little bit of a surprise to me because, at least in the past, EU has shown sort of a greater willingness to play on Split, so it being played at such an egregiously low level here actually does come as a bit of a shock. Moving on to agent pick rates, which is what many of you are going to be interested in, I'm going to take the same approach that I have in previous editions of Computing Competitive, where I will show the agent's pick rate in this competition versus its play rate in the aggregated meta overall, and then give an indicator, either an equal sign, a single up or down arrow, or a double up or down arrow to indicate the relative difference in this competition versus the aggregated meta. Starting at the very top of the list, I'm sure literally nobody is shocked to see Sage. She was played 100% of the time during the competition. Relative to her 98.3% pick rate in the overall game, it's functionally equivalent. Next up, we already hit a huge aberration in Raze, who was played 80.4% of the time during this competition, a huge showing for that agent. This is almost double her normal meta presence of 40.9%. For those of you who have followed a couple of my videos in the past, you know that EU does have a much stronger preference for Raze, where if you look at NA players, they commonly go Common Core plus Sova. EU really likes to lean into Common Core plus Raze, or at least has historically. And so I think that this is very, very telling of just how extreme that preference is. Moving on to Brimstone, he was played quite a bit less than he usually was, at 78.6% in this competition relative to his 87.2% in the overall meta. I don't think that this is necessarily reflective of Brimstone being perceived as overtly better or worse than he has been in the past. I think that this is more a reflection of people's willingness to broaden their overall pick pool and him naturally regressing in pick rate based on that. Next up, we have Cypher, who suffers a similar fate, although it's quite a bit more extreme. He was played 66.1% throughout the G2 EU Brawl, which is a shocking 20% lower than his overall pick rate. Again, if you've watched some of my previous videos, I've mentioned repeatedly that EU sort of likes to play aggressive, they like to play fast, and I think that their prioritization of agents other than Cypher is kind of natural given that. Coming in at 5th on the ladder, we have Sova, who comes in at a 48.2% play rate, which is functionally equivalent to his overall play rate of 50%. Next up, we hit an agent who's completely out of place for people who have been watching my other meta-analyses, which is Jett. She comes in at a 39.3% play rate, more than double her normal play rate of 17.5%. My working rationale as to why this is happening is I think that a lot of pros are getting more comfortable with the dynamics of opping in Valorant. They're quite different from the opping dynamics in CSGO. And I think that as people get more comfortable with that playstyle, you're seeing more and more Jett as she is a natural op user. Next up, we have another oddball, but of a much slighter degree in Phoenix. He saw a 33.9% play rate in this competition, up from his 23.6% play rate in the overall meta. I've mentioned a couple times in the past that EU is a little bit more flexible in what they are willing to pick, and I think that this is more or less a reflection of that. If you look at the two primary entry frag options, you have both Breach and Phoenix, and while NA and frankly the world at large shows a very strong preference for Breach, EU has been the region to most frequently swap him out for Phoenix. And that brings us right to the man himself, Breach. He drops astronomically to a 30.4%, almost 40% down from his usual 68.8%. This is pretty hard to explain too. Obviously, we didn't see some crazy 30% spike in Phoenix's play rate, and so when we dig down into the compositions, and we'll do a bit of this later, we see that Breach was frequently losing his spot on rosters to Razes and to Jets. I think that this is a reflection of teams getting more comfortable in how they play the game overall, and so you'll see rosters picking compositions more based off of a specific utility loadout to suit certain execution strategies, as opposed to picking the strongest raw power level entry fragger. Next up, we have Omen, who's more or less stayed exactly where we expect him to be, at 19.6% play rate relative to his usual 18.6%. Looking for scraps as usual, at the bottom we have Viper. She comes in at barely over a third of her usual play rate at 3.6% relative to her usual 9.1%. And so we definitely had a bit of weird stuff going on here. It being an EU-only competition, you can expect a lot of it. We know that they like to play fast, we know that they like to play aggressive, we know that a lot of the time they like to lean into offensively skewed compositions whenever they really can. And so seeing huge skews in favor of things like Raze and skews away from things like Cypher, it's frankly not that surprising, but one thing that's going to be even more interesting is where they are pushing in that direction. What are their compositions? We know that the most prolific compositions on a global level are going to be common core compositions and molten core compositions. So those comps are inherently defensively skewed. They don't like to play super aggressively, and so given EU's natural dynamics, are they running those comps or are they running completely different things? To take a good look at this, I've pulled up the top 5 compositions from the competition. This naturally made a lot of sense because every composition below this top 5 was played at most 2 times. I know that there are only 4 on your screen. Trust me, it's that way for a reason. We'll get there. Right off the top, we immediately have an answer to the question I just posed, which is that, yes, EU still plays a lot of Common Core. We have the Common Core plus Raze as the highest played composition. Below that, we actually have a composition that I just mentioned in my most recent video about the patch 0.50 metagame changes, in that we have Shock and Awe plus Cypher. For those of you who haven't gotten around to that video yet, Shock and Awe is a compositional core created out of Brimstone, Raze, Sage, and Sova, and we very commonly see it paired with both Cypher and Breach. It's pretty reaffirming to have brought up that composition as sort of a rising star in the metagame and then have that immediately confirmed in the next competition. Next up though, we have a complete oddball in that we have Brimstone, Cypher, Jett, Raze, and Sage. This doesn't really follow any compositional archetypes that I've discussed thus far, and it's a little bit of an oddball. You basically have the common core, but you've swapped out Breach for Raze, and you're using Jet as your 5th man flex, presumably in this case as an AWPer. This composition was particularly favored by Team Turkey, who made kind of a surprise run all the way to the semifinals of this competition, despite having some of the least known names in the tournament. Rounding out the 4 I'm showing you right now, we have another really odd composition that doesn't really follow any of the archetypes I've brought up to date, in that we have Brimstone, Jet, Phoenix, Sage, and Sova. The closest thing that this replicates is going to be Shock and Awe, where you've traded out Raze for Phoenix and then brought in the Jet as your 5th flex. When we pull up the pick rates as well as the win rates, you see that these compositions, despite being the highest played, were far from being overtly dominant. There wasn't one of them that was taking up 60% of the meta like we frequently see with Common Core plus Sova in North American tournaments. It was far more spread, and it's interesting because you see the win rates relatively clustered as well. That top comp, the Common Core plus Raze, being at 51.5%, the Shock and Awe plus Cypher coming in at 53.1%, the Brim, Cypher, Jet, Raze, Sage comp coming in at a whopping 56.3%, and Brimstone, Jet, Phoenix, Sage, Sova coming in at a relatively disappointing 46.3%. I should clarify before moving on that these win rates are round win rates, not match win rates. If we were doing it by match win rates, I don't think we would be able to get anything of meaningful value out of the sample, and so we've used round wins instead. Now, moving on to the reason that I was hiding this 5th comp from you. For those of you who have been with me for at least a couple of days, you know that in my most recent video, I talked pretty extensively about how I think Omen is a great alternative for Brimstone, and how I was waiting for someone to try a Omen variant of Shock and Awe with Breach, but how nobody in tournament play had whipped it out just yet. And while we still haven't gotten exacted to that comp, the 5th most played comp during the G2 EU Brawl 2 was that composition, but with Phoenix instead of Breach, so a functionally equivalent composition just with a variation on the entry frag choice. And so how did it pan out? Really damn well, that's how. At 10.7% pick rate, it's technically tied for the 4th most played composition, but comes in at a 54.1% win rate, making it the 2nd winningest composition that was played throughout the tournament. You can't even make this stuff up. I talk about this composition in a video not even 3 days ago, and then a tournament sees it being played, and played pretty extensively at that, to extremely high success. I'm not vain enough to think that EU players magically found my video and were picking this because of that, but it shows that the data that I have does allow me to make pretty accurate approximations of where the meta can go. And so at least at a high level, that was the G2 Esports European Brawl 2. Little bit of cool compositional variation. This is really the first tournament that we've seen where Jet's really kind of not only coming out of the woodwork, but coming out hard and fast, and I think that's fantastic. I think it shows a really great maturation of the way that teams are playing the game, and shows that we'll probably see a lot more flashy op plays in the very near future. But that's all I got for today. So if you're enjoying my content, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And if you really are enjoying my content, you can find me on all the other standard social media on Instagram and Twitter at AnderzzTV. You can also find me streaming on a semi-frequent basis over at Twitch, also at AnderzzTV, where I throw down really spectacular low elo Valorant gameplay with my collegiate players. Hopefully we climb once launch is actually out. Thanks as always, guys. I'll see you in the next one.